Built over the ruins of an ancient Roman fort near the border of England and Scotland is one of the most besieged castles in Britain. The castle's location has thousands of years of history, including the captivity of Mary Queen of Scots, Dark Age chronicles of Merlin, and medieval stories of King Arthur, Robert the Bruce and the Scottish Wars of Independence, the Wars of the Roses, and songs of the border Reivers, famous for raiding the borderlands. It was a place of epic battles between kings and queens of England and Scotland. This is James from History Victorum. Join us as we explore the Castle of Carlisle. The Castle of Carlisle is located in northwestern England, about 10 miles south of the Scottish border. The stone castle we see today dates back to the 12th century, and it was never reduced to a ruin throughout all of its sieges. Today, we can still visit intact portions of the castle, such as its gatehouse, the captain's tower, its impressive keep, and its walls. Inside its gatehouse, we can also still see traces of an earlier fortification built by the Romans on the site. The Roman fort of Lugavalium was built in about 73 AD, about half a mile south of what would later become Hadrian's Wall. It was built on the River Eden, which gave the Romans access to the sea, and it also overlooked the main road into modern-day Scotland. The fort developed into a thriving town, and it became the largest town north of York. The castle was built partially above this fort, and the width of the castle on the south side is about the same size as the previous fort. The fort also helped give Carlisle its name. Carlisle is derived from the word cair, which means fort or stronghold, and the name of the fort, Lugavalium, which comes from the Celtic god Lugh or Lugus. We can still see Roman remains in the gatehouse of the castle today. This stone, originally placed above the doorway, was carved from a Roman altar. These altars were typically round or rectangular in shape and created as an offering to the gods. Although some of the letters are no longer visible due to the cutting of the stone to match the doorway, we can make out that this altar was dedicated by a Roman soldier to multiple gods including Juno, Minerva, Mars, and Victory. After the collapse of Roman Britain around 410 AD, new kingdoms began to form. This is one of my favorite times in history, a time of heroes and legends, including those of King Arthur. The city of Carlisle is believed to have been part of the lost ancient kingdom of Rheged, which is believed to have extended into parts of modern-day England and Scotland. A bard who lived in the area during the late 6th century was named Merlin the Wild, who was the inspiration for the later Merlin. In the Black Book of Carmarthen, which contains Welsh poetry transmitted via oral tradition through the centuries, Merlin writes of a great battle that occurred just outside of Carlisle near modern-day Logtown in the late 6th century. In the losing battle, his king, Gwynthelau, was killed. Merlin was driven mad after all the bloodshed and went to live in the forest. The Annals of Wales date this battle to 573 AD. This king, Gwynthelau, is believed by some scholars to have been king of Carlisle at the time. According to the Book of Taliesin, one of the oldest texts in the Welsh language, King Gwynthelau had one of the 13 treasures of Britain, a magic game board that was made from gold and silver. Merlin is said to have collected these 13 treasures and carried them to an island off of Wales. In the later Middle Ages, Carlisle would be specifically mentioned in many popular Arthurian stories, possibly due to memories of the historical late 6th century kings of Rheged. These include King Urien, the King of Kings, who had twin boys with a woman named Mordred, the inspiration for the half-sister of King Arthur, Morgan Le Fay. His son Owain was the inspiration for the Arthurian knight Yvain, famous for having a pet lion. Urien was assassinated in the late 6th century during a siege at Lindisfarne, and the kingdom of Rheged was eventually absorbed into Northumbria. We are lucky enough to have a brief description of Carlisle from the historian Bede, who writes of a visit from St. Cuthbert in the 7th century. He describes Carlisle as a ruined Roman city, with Roman walls still standing, and a remarkable Roman fountain, which likely means that the Roman aqueduct was still supplying Carlisle with water at the time. It was here at Carlisle that, according to Bede, Cuthbert would have a vision of a defeat of the Northumbrians against the Picts. The king of Northumbria, Edgefrith, would lead an army northward in battle against the Picts, while his queen, Irembert, waited for him at Carlisle, possibly because she was from Carlisle or had family there. Cuthbert's prophecy would prove true, and the king himself was slain in battle, and the Picts regained their territory in the north. In the 9th century, Carlisle would be raided by Vikings. Halfdan and Ivor the Boneless led the great heathen army across Britain. In 865, Halfdan, known as the Wide Embrace, raided Northumbria and Carlisle in 875. Carlisle would then become disputed lands between England and Scotland. Much of the stone castle we see today dates all the way back to the 12th century. For much of its existence, Carlisle has been under the control of England. But this was not always the case. In 1092, Carlisle was conquered by King William II, son of William the Conqueror, who took it over from a man named Dolphin, who likely had allegiance to the King of Scots. William then constructed a castle of some sort here, probably of wood and earth. The impressive stone keep we see today is believed to have been begun by another son of William the Conqueror, Henry I of England, but it was completed by David I of Scotland. After Henry I died in 1135, David invaded England and took over the town of Carlisle and other parts of northern England. He retained the castle for the remainder of his reign, and David died within the castle walls. Much of the keep still dates from this time. It is 69 feet high, but was originally taller as the roof was later lowered for the placement of guns. This doorway was made in the 16th century, but likely replaced the 12th century original doorway, which was once guarded by a portcullis. Its lowest floor would have been for storage, possibly for heavier items such as barrels of beer, and was at times used for prisoners. On the first floor was its great hall. In the 12th century, about 25 men, including knights and crossbowmen, would have had their meals in this hall and slept on its floors. Here we can see a 12th century window. The hall was originally more open than it is today, with a wall added later for stability. It was here that medieval kings would receive visitors and petitioners. In the Middle Ages, we have to imagine the wall covered with tapestries and plastered over. A latrine was accessed from a curved passage which would help reduce the smell. The upper floor contained living quarters for the king, as well as a kitchen and a fireplace. These rooms originally had a high ceiling before it was divided into 2 floors in the 16th century for stability. Through this door and to the right was a small chapel. It was thought to have been here where David I died at Carlisle. Nearby are one of the most famous parts of Carlisle, known as the prisoners' carvings. Many of these seem to have been carved by a single person. There are depictions of fantastic beasts, some possibly forgotten scenes from folklore, and much heraldry of the time. This piece of armor was particularly interesting to me, which looks to be from the 15th century. Due to the heraldry, we can date these more precisely to about 1480, when Richard, Duke of Gloucester, the later King Richard III, controlled Carlisle. This was during the time of the Wars of the Roses, which were bloody English civil wars fought in the late 15th century between the powerful factions of Lancaster and York. Here we can make out a depiction of the White Rose of York. After a Yorkist victory in the Battle of Towton in 1461, which may be the bloodiest battle ever fought on British soil, Warwick, the Kingmaker, was granted control of Carlisle. Soon afterward, the Lancasters provoked the Scots to attack Carlisle, supposedly making them a promise that if they could take the castle, they could keep it. But reinforcements arrived, and 6,000 Scots were said to have been killed. Warwick would control the region for 9 years. When he did something unexpected, Warwick would switch sides. He traveled to France to join with the Lancasters, and left a force in charge of the castle. King Edward IV sent a message for the citizens of Carlisle to rise up and take the castle, and they eventually succeeded after a siege. The castle was then transferred to Richard of Gloucester, who in a few years would become King Richard III. Here we can see a depiction of a boar, which was the symbol of Richard III. Also, on the city walls connected to the castle, this tower, known as the Tile Tower, is believed to have been constructed by Richard III. The square area here on the tower is believed to have housed the white boar of Richard III. Now these are called the prisoners' carvings, but this door led to both the chapel on the right side and another room on the left, so it does seem somewhat unlikely to have been a prison. But either way, they are an important window into the past. A medieval door which led to these carvings still survives here and has carvings from the 18th century. The castle is guarded by inner and outer gatehouses. Both of the gatehouses were originally constructed back in the 12th century by King Henry II, who had regained control of Carlisle and much of northern England after David I of Scotland had died. The gatehouse was originally approached via a drawbridge. We can still see a drawbridge in this painting made in the 18th century. The gate was guarded by two sets of large wooden doors and a portcullis. The doors on both sides of the gatehouse open inwards, allowing the gatehouse to withstand a siege from within as well as outside the city walls. The doors themselves in medieval times were made from heavy oak and were often studded with iron, which would help strengthen the doors and also blunt swords and axes of attackers trying to break through. The gatehouse doors we see today likely date to just after the execution of Mary Queen of Scots in 1587. After the trial of Mary, there was an increasing amount of raids on the borderlands near Carlisle. 100 men were sent up to help defend Carlisle, and the doors were remade using 10 oak trees. Some timbers have been replaced, but the door still survives today. More on Mary later. The gatehouse is known as Ireby's Tower, and we're not really sure why it has that name. It's believed to have come from William de Ireby, who was a knight from the 13th century. He had the title of Master of the Royal Hounds, and we have records from around 1215 of King John of England sending dogs to Carlisle in the care of Ireby for hunting in the Carlisle forest. The unpopular King John stayed at the castle several times. He spent money on the castle and may have built this outer stone wall of the castle in the early 13th century. This stretch of wall on the right side of the gatehouse still dates from this time. But these walls would soon afterward be breached by the Scots in an impressive siege by Alexander II of Scotland in 1215. 30 years earlier, King William the Lion of Scotland had nearly regained Carlisle from Henry II during a rebellion of King Henry led by his sons and his wife Eleanor of Aquitaine. William put Carlisle under siege twice, in 1173 and 1174. He nearly succeeded in 1174, but William himself was captured after a reckless charge at Alnwick Castle, and the siege of Carlisle ended. In the early 13th century, the oppression of the people by King John caused another rebellion. During this rebellion, Alexander II of Scotland managed to use miners to undermine its walls and captured the castle after a 3-month siege in 1216. But after King John died that year, his more popular son Henry III of England won several victories. Pope Honorius had Alexander II and other Scottish nobles excommunicated from the church. He would manage to receive absolution on the condition that he give up Carlisle. The castle would see much fighting in the First Scottish War of Independence, which was fought from 1296 to 328. This war is well known to us today from famous figures such as William Wallace, Edward I, and Robert the Bruce. In fact, the Scottish Wars of Independence were believed to have started right here at Carlisle. In 1296, Robert Bruce, the father of the future King Robert the Bruce, was governor of Carlisle. The Bruces had a famous rivalry with the powerful Comyn family, who controlled much of northern Scotland. In 1296, an attack was made on Carlisle by John Comyn, cousin of John the Red Comyn, who would later be murdered by Robert the Bruce. After 4 days, the attack was abandoned for lack of siege engines, but the Comyns raided the surrounding towns. This was typically considered to be the first battle in the Scottish Wars of Independence. The Bruces, along with other Scottish nobles, were still allied to Edward I of England at the time. Edward retaliated by bringing a force into northern England and Scotland. 1 year later, in 1297, William Wallace would lead a force to Carlisle. He sent a messenger into the city, threatening that the citizens would be slaughtered if they did not surrender. He abandoned the idea of a siege, seeing the strong defenses of Carlisle. Once Bruce joined the rebellion and was crowned king in 1306, Edward once again led a force north and confiscated much of Bruce's lands. Carlisle would be attacked in a siege by Robert the Bruce in 1315. 8 years earlier, Bruce's 2 younger brothers, Thomas and Alexander, were captured and executed at Carlisle. Their heads were put up on spikes on the town gates. Bruce had won a great victory at Bannockburn in 1314 against Edward II, who was much less competent than his father had been, and Bruce brought an army south to Carlisle in 1315. The castle was defended by Andrew Harclay, Sheriff of Cumberland, who we can see here in a contemporary drawing of the Siege of Robert the Bruce, made just 1 year later in 1316. This is a rare surviving drawing of contemporary Scottish warfare. The Scots are shown holding axes and bows, and wearing some sort of hooded garment and leather shoes. Here we can make out miners trying to undermine the city walls. This was a successful tactic at the time, and Alexander II had used this to breach the walls of Carlisle about 100 years earlier. What caught my attention was this on top of the walls. This is a rarely depicted machine called a springald, which could be wound up to load heavy bolts which could be fired down on attackers. On top is Andrew Harclay, defending Carlisle, the Sheriff of Cumberland. The sheriffs in medieval times of Carlisle typically lived inside the gatehouse, where they would also handle the finances of the area and other administrative tasks. The gatehouse contains a kitchen, living quarters, a great hall, and this raised portion believed to originally have been an area for servants. In the hall, a set of tables and chairs were set up approximately where the sheriff would have had their meals in medieval times. The kitchen contains 2 fireplaces. A hole can still be seen in this fireplace for a pot hanger, and a replica of a cauldron has been added, which in medieval times was used to cook a whole variety of foods by wrapping them individually and adding them in different layers at different levels in the cauldron. These could be seasoned with herbs which were left hanging to dry. This chamber was a medieval bedroom and a sitting room. A replica medieval bed has been added, possibly from about the end of the 15th century. The room contains 2 fireplaces, one of which dates back to about the 16th century, and an earlier window. The gatehouse itself was remodeled in the late 14th century, and some of its original timbers still remain. In his siege of Carlisle, Robert the Bruce was equipped with siege engines, and we can make out a trebuchet on the drawing. But these became stuck in the muddy area around Carlisle. Carlisle was surrounded by bogs from nearby rivers which were prone at times to flooding. These were not controlled until the 18th century. Harclay, the sheriff, was an accomplished soldier and managed to hold off the attack with very few losses on the English side, and the Scots were forced to retreat. Edward II would reward Harclay for his service with a sum of 1,000 marks. But 1 year later, he would be captured by Robert the Bruce, and he had to pay 2,000 marks for his own ransom. In 1323, after being promoted Earl of Carlisle, Harclay recognized Robert Bruce as King of Scots and negotiated peace. Edward II considered this to be a betrayal, and had Harclay executed. The Inner Gatehouse is known as the Captain's Tower. Much of the tower dates to the 12th century, including this small 12th century window. It had its own moat, drawbridge, and portcullis. This tower was the residence of the high-ranking officer, responsible for the military organization of the castle itself. The inside of the gate was more finely decorated. Some of the original 14th century decorative stonework survives here, and a 16th century triple window. The tower was changed in the 19th century to a barracks, which housed as many as 25 men. In the 15th century, possibly due to memories of the Dark Age kings of Rheged, Carlisle was included in many stories of King Arthur. It is even in the great 15th century work Les Morts d'Arthur by Thomas Malory, which is basically the story of Arthur that we know today. In this story, Camelot is mentioned as being in Winchester, but Arthur holds court at times at Carlisle. It was right here at Carlisle where Lancelot and Guinevere were discovered, and where Guinevere was nearly burned at the stake. In another story called The Carl of Carlisle, written in about 1400, Carlisle is owned by a giant. A carl at the time means something like a free man who is just below a nobleman. I like this story because it shows the importance of chivalry at the time. Sir Gawain, separated from King Arthur, has to pass tests of courtesy by the giant Carl, or he will be killed. Carl, sounding like Carlisle, was probably a humorous coincidence at the time. During the 15th century, Carlisle would be controlled by powerful wardens of the marches. The marches are basically the territories along the Scottish borders. Some of these wardens included Henry Hotspur Percy, Richard Neville, Earl of Warwick, the Kingmaker, and Richard, Duke of Gloucester. Here, above this partially blocked postern door, is the Dacre coat of arms. Thomas Lord Dacre was appointed Warden of the Marches by Henry VII. This postern is one of the oldest parts of the castle, and has a relation to Mary Queen of Scots, who arrived at Carlisle after sailing over the border in disguise on a small fishing boat. In 1537, Mary had been forced to give up her throne in Scotland and was in prison, but she escaped and raised forces to fight one more battle to regain her throne. After her forces were defeated in the battle at Langside in 1538, Mary fled in disguise on a small fishing boat across the Solway Firth into English territory. She arrived and was brought to Carlisle and placed under armed guard. She stayed in a tower that was once here, which stood up until the 19th century. This tower connected to a large former palace, which was originally built by Edward I back in the 14th century. We have records of a bath being installed for his wife. This building is roughly on the site of the former Great Hall. The decoration on the surviving turret gives an idea of what this palace and Mary Queen of Scots Tower would have looked like. The tower once had a window facing north where Mary could look towards Scotland. She stayed for about 2 months here with her attendants. She was allowed to walk in an area outside of the castle, now known as the Ladies' Walk. The Ladies' Walk was from this postern gate to the main gatehouse. There were once 2 ash trees outside the castle, which were cut down in 1804. These were said to have been the finest and largest in the country, and were said to have been planted by Queen Mary during her stay at Carlisle. Mary would be transferred to other English castles, and this would start her long captivity in England. This postern gate is one of the oldest parts of the castle. A groove for a portcullis can still be seen. This is a remnant of the early 12th century original entrance to the Norman castle before the main gate was moved to face the city. Near to Queen Mary's Tower is a plaque made in 1577. This is a replica, and the original was placed in the Regimental Museum. This commemorates the completion of another connecting building to Queen Mary's Tower, which was paid for by Elizabeth. Tensions would rise between Queen Elizabeth and Scotland in the late 16th century, during one of my favorite stories of Carlisle, the capture of a famous border reiver, which would become an international incident between England and Scotland. The border reivers were people who lived on the borders of England and Scotland, and were famous for raiding the borderlands, both Scottish and English. In 1593, the Bishop of Carlisle wrote that most of the people within 20 miles of Carlisle were in fear of their lives, due to all the raiding that was taking place. One of the most well-known of these reivers at the time was Willie Armstrong, known as Kinmont Willie. His first raid was in 1583, and he made a name for himself by a raid on Stirling in 1585. He performed a large raid in 1593, which involved 1,000 men and captured 2,000 animals. The borderlands had their own laws, known as the Law of the Marches, which could help handle disputes. The courts would have representatives from both England and Scotland, and were held under a day of truce for all who attended. This day of truce occurred until the next sunrise. In 1596, a meeting took place under a day of truce, which included Kinmont Willie. But English soldiers could not resist the temptation to capture such a famous outlaw as Willie. He was taken illegally on his way home and brought back to Carlisle. Many Scots supported his release and did not want to violate the Law of the Marches. However, once captured, Queen Elizabeth was unwilling to release him. On April 13, 1596, during a stormy night, he was rescued during a raid on Carlisle. Stories of the raid vary, with some claiming it was 80 men to as much as 500 men, which is probably an exaggeration by Lord Scrope, the warden at the time. We aren't exactly sure where Willie was held prisoner, but he is said to have escaped through this door on the west postern gate, which was battered down, after an attempt to scale the wall with ladders failed. Kinmont Willie was never captured and is said to have died of old age, but the golden age of the border reivers was just about to end. Once Elizabeth died, James VI of Scotland became James I of England, uniting the two countries and making the laws of the marches mostly unnecessary. a council of 5 English and 5 Scottish were set up at Carlisle to hunt down any known Reivers. Many Reivers left the country, including a large portion which went to North America. A popular folk ballad of Kinmont Willie still survives today. In this passage, after his escape, he taunts the warden at the time, Lord Scrope, son of Scrope mentioned here on the plaque by Elizabeth. The area seemed to be stabilizing for now, but in 1644, Carlisle would undergo one of the most difficult sieges in its history, where it faced an army of Parliament who was intent on deposing the king. In 1644, Carlisle supported the current King of England, Charles I. During the British Civil War at the time, the army of Parliament, along with an army of Scots, besieged Carlisle. Carlisle was heavily protected with defenses that were installed a century earlier by Henry VIII. This battery here, which is a fortified place for heavy guns, was built in the 1540s in front of the Captain's Tower. This was originally at ground level before the ground was raised in the 1830s. It had 13 windows for soldiers and 3 openings for cannon. We have to imagine guns back in this time were very smoky, and vents were needed inside the battery. Smokeless gunpowder wasn't invented until the late 19th century. Also during this time, a ramp was built here to bring guns up to the castle walls. The castle managed to hold out for 8 months, but as food ran out, dogs and rats were eaten as food. The castle surrendered in 1645. Parliament would be victorious in the war, and eventually King Charles I would be executed. In the 18th century, the Scots would control Carlisle once more, during the Jacobite Rising of 1745, led by Bonnie Prince Charlie. The Jacobites at the time supported the exiled King James and his descendants. The most successful of the Jacobite risings was in 1745, where they pushed into England. About 5,000 Scots put Carlisle under siege. The city of Carlisle at the time was something of a relic of the past, as it was still surrounded by its city walls that connected to the castle. The city and castle was surrendered 10 days later when it was believed that reinforcements would not arrive. Bonnie Prince Charlie, or Charles Edward Stuart, is said to have entered Carlisle on a white horse, preceded by 100 pipers playing music. The main force of Jacobites would eventually be forced to retreat into England. They crossed the border on a ford near Logtown, which is about the same spot as the defeat in the battle described by Merlin the Wild over 1,000 years earlier. A garrison of Jacobites stayed at Carlisle to attempt to hold the important fort, but they had to surrender after the castle walls were breached by artillery. At this time, the age of British castles was coming to an end. Carlisle was the last British castle to undergo a siege. Cannon are set up on the castle walls today, which date from the 18th century. The Jacobites were thrown into prison under rough conditions, sometimes without food or water. This area in the lower levels of the keep was used as a prison for some of the Jacobites. Some stones in the walls are irregularly shaped and often moist. It is said that prisoners were so thirsty that they licked the stones into their unusual shapes. A famous song, with the chorus "You take the high road and I'll take the low road," was supposedly written at Carlisle by 2 prisoners who spoke of their homeland at Loch Lomond, one of which was sentenced to death and the other was set free. The one who was to be set free would take the high road back home, where the one to be executed would take the spiritual road, which according to Celtic legend, the soul of the dead would return home. The castle was in rough condition in the 19th century, and some buildings were on the verge of collapse and were demolished or heavily refurbished. The items in Queen Mary's Tower were sold off at auction, with the wooden beams fetching particularly high prices, with people wanting to make souvenirs out of the tower where Mary, Queen of Scots, once stayed. But military use of Carlisle continued, and parts are still in use up to the current day. If you visit the castle today, on the site is a Museum of Military Life, which has objects relating to the 300-year history of the Border Regiment, such as these objects from World War I. In the late 19th century, there was a general appreciation for the castle's long history. Former soldiers would show people around at the time. Due to this newfound appreciation for its history, any further alterations to the castle were resisted, which is partially why we can still see the original parts of the castle as they are today, and still tell stories of its thousands of years of history. Hope you enjoyed this. If you have anything else to add, let me know in the comments, and thanks for watching.